Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining us for the Naval War College Foundation's annual San Francisco Symposium, International Order and Great Power Competition. I am George Lang, CEO of the Naval War College Foundation, and I am broadcasting this morning from the Naval War College campus, specifically Spruance Hall. I am joined remotely by our 23rd Chairman of the Naval War College Foundation's Board of Trustees, Chairman Philip Bilan, and my terrific staff. We are excited and gratified to see so many members and friends of the Foundation participating today through our virtual platform. Since 2013, the San Francisco Symposium has been traditionally hosted by the Foundation in the springtime at the Marines Memorial Club and Hotel in San Francisco, California. Over the years, it has presented opportunities for hundreds of members and guests to interact with faculty, staff, students, and distinguished speakers to address the great many number of challenges in our national and international security environments. While COVID-19 has prevented us from coming together this year as a group, it will not prevent us from engaging with civilian academics and policy experts to expand our understanding of the great many security issues and challenges that we face today. We are confident that you will benefit from this interactive presentation with our very distinguished guest speakers and faculty of the Navy War College, who remain committed to the Naval War College as, and in the words of its founder, Rear Admiral Stephen B. Luce, a place of original research on all questions relating to war and to the statesmanship connected with war or the prevention of war. I know each of the speakers are looking forward to answering your questions submitted either when you registered or during this event via the chat function as time permits. I thank all who have given generously to support this event and prior events that advance the Foundation in its mission to support the Naval War College, specifically its educational organizations, accredited graduate level educational programs, research and scholarship, and centers dedicated to geographic regions like the Asia Pacific, Greater Middle East, Europe, Russia, and the polar risk of the Arctic region, or specific warfare area concerns like counterterrorism, irregular warfare and maritime special operations, cyber, and artificial intelligence. Allow me to recognize the following donors for their exceptional support, philanthropy, and sponsorship. At the commanding officer sponsorship level, $10,000 or more, Trustee Captain and Mrs. David Hunter, and Trustee Emeritus Commander and Mrs. Richard Rosenberg. At the executive officer sponsorship level, $5,000, Chairman and Mrs. Philip Bilan. We remain very grateful to these exceptional individuals and to all of our corporate donors, private philanthropists, trustees, members, and patriotic supporters, and for the Robert N. Miller III Memorial and Colonel John A. and Eileen F. Carr Endowment Funds for making events such as this possible. I also want to thank VideoLink for their virtual event production services, expertise, and support for today's symposium. They have been a terrific partner. For over 50 years, the Foundation has relied on the generous support of its trustees and members and donors to enhance and enrich the academic program and educational experience at the college by providing additional financial resources, not readily available due to other defense and service-related spending priorities, for a host of college priorities, including endowed chairs, conferences and symposia, international student outreach and educational programs, faculty and student achievement awards, and capital improvements. Your contributions reinforce and sustain the prestige and excellence of the Naval War College, the oldest institution of its kind, and its mission to educate and develop leaders in the strategic and operational challenges that lie ahead. Your continued support for and trust in the Foundation to educate today, secure tomorrow, represents an investment not only in the Naval War College, but in our great nation's national security and position on the global stage. Before I turn the mic over to Chairman Bilan, I want to take a moment to promote the Foundation's Patriots Auction that opened yesterday at 8 a.m. and will remain open through Monday until 3 p.m. We had a lot of fun with the auction that we hosted in conjunction with our annual Newport Summer Symposium in August, and we were hopeful for a similar experience with this weekend's auction. There are some wonderful Naval War College memorabilia, autographed books, paintings, and other opportunities up for bid. So I invite you to participate and compete for your favorite auction item or items. Obviously, proceeds from the auction will go to benefit academic programs and other priorities of greatest need at the Naval War College. Pressing forward with the program, our chairman would now like to extend his gratitude to you for your support and will introduce our first guest speaker. Philip?
Thank you very much, George, and a warm welcome to all attending our annual San Francisco Symposium. I am Philip Bilan, and I'm honored to have taken the helm as chairman of the Naval War College Foundation this June at a very exciting and challenging time in our 51-year history. I want to emphasize our CEO's sincere gratitude to our foundation members and supporters, our trustees and emeriti, our regional directors, and our distinguished speakers. All have generously given their time and philanthropic support to today's discussion. The San Francisco Symposium events have become important in our national dialogue on the essential role of our joint military forces and our leaders in deterring aggression, securing the peace, partnering with allies around the globe to maintain stability, prosperity, and our democratic freedoms as a nation. Today's topic, great power competition and its impact on the international order, is at the very core of our national interests and the strategic focus of our Navy and our joint forces. The Naval War College Foundation is front and center in supporting our military and national leaders to confront strategic challenges with China, Russia, and a range of state and non-state actors. This particular year, 2020, will be remembered in history for the impact of a global pandemic on the international order. The coronavirus emanating from China has impacted our national economy, politics, and geostrategic interests around the globe, as it has every other nation state. And our military leaders have been studying the pandemic for lessons learned at the Naval War College, as we heard from distinguished faculty at our recent annual meeting. Here in Newport at the Naval War College, the foundation and our school have had many disruptions over the year, given the need to convene classes and events such as this virtually. We're grateful to everyone for contributing and cooperating to help us get through this. Nonprofit organizations around the country generally have been very hard hit by the pandemic's financial impact on fundraising. And the Naval War College Foundation is no exception. However, I'm very proud to tell you that our team has faced these unprecedented challenges head on with resilience and innovation, finding new ways to engage our members to raise critical philanthropic funds for our mission to support our warfighter students and future leaders. But we will need your continued support. I am fortunate to serve with our Vice Chairman, Mr. Dan Holland, who will be impactful in our leadership going forward as we build on a solid financial and operational foundation. Dan has offered wise counsel and kept us in a position of financial strength as our treasurer and finance committee chairman over the years. And you'll hear from Dan later in the program on the importance of your financial support to educate today to secure tomorrow. We're also very fortunate to have recruited last year our CEO, Captain George Lang. George took the helm of the foundation after 3 years of dutiful service in uniform in the US Navy. And he has worked tirelessly to build an A-team of staff to achieve our foundation's board's strategic objectives. Number one, to professionalize and modernize our foundation processes. Number two, to achieve financial strength through fundraising. Number three, to meaningfully engage our members around the nation and to be relevant in your philanthropic considerations. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, is for the foundation to have strategic impact to the Navy and the national security of the country through the Naval War College support. So we all thank George and his team for pulling together this symposium in difficult and extraordinary times to address the important national security issues with academic and policy leaders such as our colleagues today. It is my honor to introduce our distinguished first guest speaker, Dr. Colin Jackson. Dr. Jackson serves as chairman of the Strategic and Operational Research Department at the U.S. Naval War College. He represents the excellence of our Naval War College faculty with a career of distinguished military service, national security policymaking, and academic achievement. Dr. Jackson oversees the work of research groups that our foundation supports to address regional and functional challenges in the maritime and cyber domains, including the Institutes for China Maritime Studies, Russia Maritime Studies, Cyber and Innovation Policy, and Future Warfare Studies. Dr. Jackson recently served from 2017 to 2019 as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense DASD, for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. He knows the region very well from experience in and out of uniform. Dr. Jackson has been responsible for U.S. defense policy throughout the region, advancing U.S. national security interests through defense strategy development, security cooperation, contingency planning, and in program oversight. His duties included, among others, the statutory oversight of $5 billion annual Afghan Security Force Fund. He served as the senior Defense Department rep to the U.S. Taliban peace talks. Earlier in his career, Dr. Jackson had deployed to Afghanistan, where he served in uniform as the XO Executive Officer for Policy Planning for the Deputy Chief of Staff of Operations for International Security Assistance Force, Afghanistan. And 2 years prior to that, he served as the Senior Civilian Advisor to Task Force Mountain Warrior in Jalalabad, Afghanistan. Dr. Jackson is a recipient of the Bronze Star and Department of Defense Medal for distinguished public service, and he continues to serve in the U.S. Army Reserve. Prior to his service in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Dr. Jackson was here at the U.S. Naval War College as the director of the Advanced Strategist Program and a professor in the Strategy and Policy Department. He is exceedingly well educated, holds several advanced degrees, including bachelor's from Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School, an MBA from Wharton, a master's from Johns Hopkins SAIS School of Advanced International Studies, and a PhD in political science and security studies from MIT. And I had to truncate a lot of those distinguished degrees in the interest of time. But ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present Dr. Colin Jackson.
Well, thank you, Philip and George, for that kind introduction. I often can't recognize who is being described in these introductions. It certainly isn't me, but I'm happy to join you today to talk about a subject somewhat removed from my recent involvement in the small wars of Central Asia. And really what I'm here to talk to you about today is U.S. grand strategy at the largest level. I'll say at the outset, my only regret in this is that I'm not joining you in the Bay Area. I grew up in Berkeley, California, so I have a very fond memories of the region, but hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about some things that stimulate useful questions and get us thinking on important topics here. So in my opening slide, I presented you 4 images which would appear to be only loosely related. On the upper left corner, you see a picture of the first meeting of the League of Nations Council in 1920. This was a council created after Woodrow Wilson's drive for the League of Nations. This was the liberal institution that was, in theory, to prevent the reemergence of world conflict. Just below it on the left-hand side is the image of German troops 16 years later reoccupying the German Rhineland in overt abrogation of the Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Locarno. In this ultimate test of the power of liberal institutions, the League of Nations fundamentally failed. So within the space of 16 years, you go from the great promise of an international institution restraining world conflict to 16 years later, it falling relatively swiftly to aggressive moves by a German rival. In the center at the top there is a picture of the signing ceremony with which the People's Republic of China in 2001 entered the World Trade Organization. And this was a signature moment for an American grand strategy of engagement with China. The theory here was by allowing China to enter the WTO, to grow wealthy, that China would do 2 things. It would be integrated with the world order, and it would become more moderate over time. This, again, a classic liberal concept of grand strategy. Commerce and interaction in this way tends to dull the incentives for war. However, roughly 15 years later, on the top right, you see a picture of Woody Island in the Paracels. This is in the South China Sea. And what we see is tangible moves by the People's Republic of China to fortify and militarize disputed territories in the South China Sea, attempting again to revise an international order the United States created. And so what we're seeing in this picture is a sort of a theme I want to explore here. It is, at one level, the failure of liberal institutional models of guaranteeing cooperative security. However noble the aspirations, these things have tended to fall in the face of determined opponents. But what I'm also going to argue to you is we're in the middle of a transition, in a sort of a realist awakening to the seriousness of the China competition, to the seriousness of the Russia competition. And yet, I will argue, we are well short of a coherent and fully specified grand strategy for the United States. So that will be the sort of set of themes we'll explore here. And it all falls under the rubric of this notion of sort of homework yet to be completed by the American national security architecture. All right, so what I'm going to talk to you about first is, okay, what is liberalism? What is realism in the American foreign policy tradition? We'll talk about why I think while we're in the midst of a realist awakening, we're well short of a grand strategy. I'll talk a little bit about why liberal grand strategy worked fine between the end of the Cold War and around 2008, why we've started to shift, and then give you two heuristics, two ways of thinking about the questions that need to be answered if we're going to move beyond a recognition of a realist threat, a recognition of fundamental opponents and rivals in China and Russia, towards something like a fully framed out grand strategy akin to the ones that we used as a country during the Cold War. And so I'm going to walk you through this process. Hopefully this will generate some interesting questions. So I open with this set of images here. What you're seeing here are the two sort of grandfathers of rival traditions in American foreign policy. On the left-hand side, obviously, Theodore Roosevelt, the sort of father of American realist foreign policy, best known for things like, pushing for the Panama Canal, truisms like, speak softly and carry a big stick. This is a man who believed in power, in the notion that world affairs were inherently competitive, and that the key to American position was essentially American power relative to other players in the international system. On the right-hand side, we see his intellectual rival, the father of the liberal tradition in American grand strategy, and that is Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was a political scientist by training, focused really on American domestic politics in the main before he becomes president, devoutly religious, and his religiosity and belief infuse a lot of his policy positions with this idea of righteousness. He sees a world primarily disrupted by unnecessary competition along the lines outlined by Theodore Roosevelt, and promises instead a different order, one dominated by democratic states, dominated by liberal institutions like the League of Nations. And these are his answers to the problem, the dilemma of sort of prospective world conflict. So imagine these two schools, one realist focused on the necessity, the inevitability of conflict and power aggregation, and on the other hand, a liberal tradition that relies on institutions. If I were to boil this down, realism versus liberalism, this is the difference between, on the one hand, a realist vision that is zero sum. Any gain by my opponent is a loss to me. And here we could see in our contemporary view, someone like Vladimir Putin, who believes that any advance by the West is a loss for Russia. On the other hand, the liberal tradition under Wilson is one that envisions sort of win-win solutions, positive sum games. The notion that China could grow richer in the 2000s, but that did not hurt US foreign policy. So imagine this grand rivalry between these two schools. And what we're really talking about is a period in which the liberal model, in my argument, is less and less effective at explaining or illuminating the problems that we face. So what's my thesis? I think essentially the liberal grand strategy of the post-Cold War period has largely collapsed. And it started to collapse as early as the mid-2000s And the question is, what does a reemergence of a realist foreign policy, a grand strategy, look like? As you've heard me say, I think we're halfway down that path. And my contention is that historical analogies can illuminate potentially the kinds of questions we must ask as a country, as a foreign policy elite, to get from the realist awakening to a coherent and complete grand strategy. So what happened with liberal grand strategy after the Cold War? With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States was essentially unchallenged for a considerable period of time. Our military might, our economic might simply did not have a ready challenger. The kinds of prescriptions, that is democratization, free markets, open commerce, were very compelling, not only in the developed world, not only in the former Soviet orbit, but also in the developing countries worldwide. And so for this long glide path from 1989 to around 2008, this was a very compelling and unchallenged position we had. Things start to fall apart in the 2000s, I think, for a number of reasons. One is that power and the exercise of power by the United States, however justified or righteous, et cetera, tends to lead to greater entanglement and greater ambition. For lack of a better term, the United States gets out over its skis here in this period. We see the expansion of formal alliance commitments with NATO enlargement, and a series of things that sort of get us deeper and deeper into the costs of exerting hegemony. At the same time, we dramatically cut our military spending. And what do I mean by this? I mean, in empirical terms, we go from a Cold War, late Cold War spending of around 6% of US GDP on defense down under 3% at a certain point, and we're now roughly at around 3.5% of US GDP. So we're spending as a defense burden relative to the economy roughly half of what we were at the tail end of the Cold War. At the same time, there was a failure fundamentally of a totally plausible theory of influence vis-a-vis China and Russia. What was our theory of influence? The liberal theory of influence vis-a-vis these two rivals. The idea was that by integrating things like China and Russia with a capitalist economy, that two things would happen. One, they would grow wealthier and therefore more secure, less fearful. And second, that they would moderate their politics through involvement in international commerce. And ultimately, both of them would evolve in the direction of democratic and satisfied states. This did not fundamentally work. And this was a grand controversy in the 90s and 2000s. Now I think it's a settled argument. Instead, what we see is China grows dramatically wealthier, and with its wealth grows its ambition to revise an international order largely articulated by the United States. In the case of Russia, we don't see a huge economic rebound, but what we see is sort of unsatisfied resentment flowing from the Cold War, a desire to resettle the score, to retrade the deal at the end of the Cold War, and essentially reassert its status both in Europe and globally. So what we've seen here, and it's a bipartisan awakening, is a return to realism. If liberal prescriptions like the UN, the WTO, free commerce, trade and exchange, democratization are no longer working by the mid-2000s, what might? And what we see here is first the Obama administration saying essentially we are going to disengage from the Middle East, from places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're going to shift our attention to China. At the same time, however, we see as they edge towards a realist framing of the situation with China, we see some of the echoes of a liberal understanding of the prevention of conflict. What do I mean by this? The Obama administration enters its Russia relations and its Iran relations firmly convinced that some form of reset with both countries will again lead to greater harmony and a diminution of the threat of war. Neither of these things quite pan out the way that they planned. I think even the Obama administration would admit that the Russia reset was largely a failure. And the Iran deal, for an array of reasons we can talk about, I think also falls into that category, at least arguably. However, while Obama identifies realism as more important as Chinese aggressiveness increases, as Russian aggressiveness increases, the so-called pivot to Asia under Obama ends up being more of a pirouette. It's an announcement of a priority, but not many resources follow it. So I think we could label the Obama period as a beginning of a realist awakening, but well short of a real change in priorities and resources. So under the Trump administration, the three individuals pictured here, obviously Secretary Mattis, Secretary Tillerson, and General McMaster, this first security cabinet of President Trump articulates in 2017 a national security strategy and a national defense strategy that are explicitly realist and focused on China and Russia. So this is an important step forward from the Obama tradition, which says, okay, maybe there are realist elements in the world. Now we're to a point where we're specifying our opponent or rivals, and we are actively disengaging from Iraq and Afghanistan. What is going on inside the American domestic political order, however, is critically important. And this is a question mark that hangs over the situation to this day, and I would say into the next administration. On the one hand, it is truly striking the degree of elite consensus on the problem of China and its seriousness. That's why I describe this period we're living through as a great awakening. I think there's a recognition that the liberal engagement strategy with China has failed. And Democrats and Republican foreign policy leaders seem to understand and agree on reprioritizing China as issue number one in the security realm. However, we're at a period that appears to be a low ebb of US mass interest, popular interest in foreign affairs. People are in the main frustrated and not very interested in foreign affairs. To the extent that they see US involvement in foreign affairs, they tend to see it as a negative. They see involvement in trade, alliance commitments, and small wars as more costly than they were worth. So again, the popular disenchantment with foreign affairs and forward engagement is really palpable. This is expressed in both of the last presidents. Obama and Trump have both reflected this popular mood of disenchantment with liberal internationalism. And as a result, what we see is that this elite consensus among foreign policy professionals, Republican and Democrat, is in fact under pressure from above and below. Presidents appear more leery than their advisors of getting involved in costly engagements of any variety, and popular support remains at an all-time low. All right, so what homework remains to be done, I'm going to attack in two different ways here. So if we agree that maybe the realist model is a better representation of the kind of world we're seeing, a kind of a more of a zero-sum competition between China and the United States, between the United States and Russia, what are we to make of it? E.H. Carr, the man pictured here on the left, wrote a book in 1939 entitled The 20 Years Crisis. The book is a very extended criticism of the collapse of liberal institutions in the years leading up to the Second World War. But he's the first to point out that realism itself has fundamental limitations. And this quotation captures it. He says, consistent realism, that is a focus on an amoral competition for power, excludes four things which appear to be essential to all effective political thinking: a finite goal, an emotional appeal, a right of moral judgment, and a grounds for action. And I'll walk through what I think he means here, what he refers to as the missing springs of action. In the period, let's say, of the First World War, what Wilson, the liberal, provides in the call for war is a finite goal. And that finite goal is the war to end all wars. This may not be analytically accurate. It may be an overstatement, but what it does is it awakens emotional support among an indifferent or ambivalent population. So again, the explicit finite goal, war to end all wars, articulated here on the far left in his address to Congress, allows him to tap into broad support that might not have been there for a completely amoral contest between various great powers. a right of moral judgment. Here again, Wilson stands out vis-a-vis his realist rivals in saying we are on the moral high ground vis-a-vis Germany in the First World War. He points to things like unrestricted submarine warfare, the rape of Belgium, the sinking of the Lusitania, the Zimmermann telegram, as examples of treachery by the Germans, which justify, again, what would appear to be a power-driven entry into the First World War. But most importantly, what E.H. Carr specifies is that pure realism never gives you the reason to do anything. It simply explains the way the world works. You must populate that with a reason to act in some setting. And here again, the grounds for action for the Americans is the initiation of unrestricted submarine warfare. This becomes the entree for the United States into the First World War. Filling in the gaps. So if we're to take Carr's comment that realism is a partial answer, but that you're missing these springs of action, what would this look like in a contemporary US environment? And here, we can start to crawl towards a formulation that might be compelling. I think in the case of the current administration, we're well short of a really finite goal. It is not clear in our competition with China whether our role is containment but not saying it, whether it is simply a neo-isolationist impulse titled America First. But we are well short of a very well-articulated goal that can awaken emotional support in an American electorate that is skeptical of the value of US engagement in the world or US engagement in a costly competition with China. We can imagine emotional appeals. We can imagine an appeal to lost American jobs. We can imagine lost American status in the Pacific, but these are a little ephemeral. We could also imagine an appeal to the suppression of freedoms. And here we look at Hong Kong, we look at the repression bordering on small-scale genocide in Xinjiang province or in Tibet. So we could imagine emotional appeals, but I would argue these have been dramatically underplayed in the American foreign policy realm under this administration. Our right of moral judgment. What is our claim in the 21st century vis-a-vis China to the moral high ground? I think under the Obama administration, this is a personal opinion, that the emphasis on apologies for missteps by the United States undercut our ability to speak with unequivocal moral authority on the conflicts that matter, that is the emerging competitions with China and to a lesser extent Russia. So there was a sort of a double-edged sword of Obama's early emphasis on apologizing for missteps in the Middle East. I think more important under this administration has been the failure to make the most of Chinese aggression in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, and the South China Sea. Again, we appear either not to have fully articulated this, or our messages fall on deaf ears because of the countervailing message from the Trump administration that this is all about American self-interest. So there's an internal tension here in this administration that, again, I think is foiling our efforts to come to a right of moral judgment. And the bottom line is we have yet to articulate what are our grounds for action. When are we going to draw a line with China, over what and in what way? And we've seen tentative efforts with a sort of a dry erase marker here, trade conflict, increased discussions of defense cooperation in Southeast Asia and East Asia. But again, we're well short of a very clear definition of this. What I'm going to suggest to you is that there's a second way of looking at the incompleteness of where we stand on American grand strategy. And here I'm going to make reference to these two individuals, George Kennan on the left and Paul Nitze on the right. These, again, are the godfathers of two rival schools of containment in the early Cold War. Why are they relevant? Because they went from the notion of containment as a goal, as a finite goal, towards the articulation of a full grand strategy. And what I'm going to show you here is essentially a stylized version drawn from John Lewis Gaddis's History, Strategies of Containment, which juxtaposes the answers that first Kennan and then Nitze provided to very similar but profound questions. If we're going to contain the Soviet Union, we have to answer what is important. For Kennan, it was all about a finite number of industrial centers, and everything outside of that we could safely and prudently ignore. So we cared about Europe, we cared about North America, we cared about Japan, but we did not care about a very poor China during the late 1940s. Nitze, on the other hand, somewhat later articulates the opposite position. He says, no, to contain the Soviet Union, one must resist aggression by the Soviets everywhere it crops up. So this is this juxtaposition of strong point defense versus perimeter defense. They disagreed on things like the nature of the communist alliance. For Kennan, this was potentially fissile. It could be broken apart if we were clever. We could divide communists against each other. For Nitze, all communists fell under a more or less homogenous group. Which instruments were most important in containment? For Kennan, it was diplomacy, information, political warfare, covert action. Whereas for Nitze, this was a very clean-cut issue of trying to apply military remobilization to the problem of containment. So again, we're seeing this same question, two rival answers, both pursuing nominally the same goal of containment. I'll skip down to the bottom, risks. What did Kennan worry about? Kennan worried about us becoming overextended, exhausting ourselves in a long struggle with the Soviet Union, and making mistakes abroad. And later in his career, he would point to things like Vietnam as the sort of canonical mistake of overreach under containment. On the other hand, Nitze was almost worried about the exact opposite set of things: underextension, a failure to defend our allies, insufficient military mobilization, and essentially failing to come to the aid of embattled states. So here, as an example, is the type of intellectual work that must flow from a recognition of a realist world. I would argue we have not done the homework to answer these or similar questions. So I'll skip quickly through this. If we were to apply the same reasoning to the grand strategy for China, one could imagine answers not unlike the ones provided by Kennan and Nitze, questions not unlike the ones they asked, but they would look very different in the answers we might come to, rival answers perhaps, on how to think about the strategic competition with China. So an example, what is important in our competition with China? Is it geography? Is it the South China Sea? Is it intellectual property rights? Is it economic competition? Is it international lending? It could be any of a number of these things, but we have yet to arrive at a coherent and stable set of answers to these questions. The alliance structure, which loomed so large in the Cold War, seems less significant right now. I think the operative question, for instance, in the China competition is really, what's the relationship between the United States and China and neutral parties in Asia? What's the nature of the relationships with places like Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and the Philippines? Second, what is our situation here? Which realms of competition are most important? Are they military realms of competition? Are they technological? Are they economic? Which theaters should we be willing to let go in this contest? There's a very strong argument from the Trump administration now that we need to get out of the Middle East and out of Afghanistan in order to focus on China and Russia. That may be true. There's certainly an argument to be made. But again, these are explicit decisions that have yet to be fully integrated with the larger foreign policy. We face the same questions that Kennan and Nitze struggled with. How expansible are our resources? How free are we to act on this? Or are we fundamentally constrained by our resources in terms of the ambitions we can pursue? And again, what are the big risks here? Are the risks that we'll be drawn into a war, let's say by a spat over Taiwan or the Senkaku Islands? Or is the real risk that we will be too hesitant and our Asian neutrals and allies will start to lean towards China, bandwagon with China? Finally, a third risk conceivably is that we could find ourselves in a military engagement with China, a nuclear armed opponent, and find ourselves in problems where conventional actions taken in a military conflict could conceivably lead to nuclear exchange. Not a trivial problem, and one that we're spending a lot of time trying to think through. But my point here is these two heuristics, whether it is EH-CAR's springs of action, how do we think about that in the context of China, or how do we go through the same thought exercise that Kenan and Nitze did to answer the essential questions in any competition? I will end here on a simple note. I think we are in the midst of this realist awakening. We are not at the end of this journey. Our rivals have taken advantage to some extent of the situations that have grown out of COVID. It's hard to imagine the end game in Hong Kong without COVID. And I think Russia remains actively interested in disrupting not only our domestic political scene, but our standing in Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere. Iran clearly is sort of on the balls of its feet, wondering whether or not the nuclear deal will be revived under a potential Biden administration. These are the types of issues. What's the bottom line? I think no matter who wins the election in November, they will have a very hard time avoiding the dilemmas that are in front of them. I think they are largely realist dilemmas, but they need elements, these missing springs of action that EH-CAR laid out: a finite goal, an emotional appeal, a right to moral judgment, and a grounds for action. And we will be doing the very hard work, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, of trying to answer similar questions to the ones that Kenan and Nitze laid out. So I'll leave it there. Hope this has been interesting to you, and hopefully we'll get some good questions about the things unsaid here.
Dr. Jackson, thank you. Thank you very much for your thoughtful and engaging remarks. It sounds like we got the right guy on the job studying this very complex problem. Fortunately, we have just about 18 minutes remaining for questions and answers, and I'm happy to relay them to you from our guests. As I said, guests were offered the opportunity to submit questions initially when they registered, or of course they can submit them via the chat. So the first question comes from David Reynolds. And it says, does the great power competition buzzword oversimplify the international security situation and distract us from an in-depth understanding of the actors and underlying dynamics?
So it won't come as a surprise after the talk that yeah, I think it is an oversimplification, or in my formulation, it's sort of halfway to an answer. So the first part is to recognize that you're in a world where the traditional US emphasis on liberal answers to the problem of international security, that is international institutions, freedom of commerce, et cetera, all these things appear to be insufficient to address the security challenges that we're facing. So in that sense, one must come to the epiphany, I think, that we're in a more realist world, or that model does a better job of illuminating our problems. But I think David is exactly right that this is an oversimplification or an incomplete formulation. I'll give you an example I didn't touch on, but near and dear to my heart. If you read the National Defense Strategy, my old portfolio, that is the war in Afghanistan, is mentioned twice in the entire document. It is one thing to say that we want to prioritize the competition with China and Russia. It does not free you from the decision about how much you want to spend on an insurance policy against terrorism in places like Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria. It turns out that the process of answering that, how much am I willing to spend on secondary theaters, on economy of force missions, is really, really hard. And I think both the Obama administration and the Trump administration have struggled with this. And so that's an example where it's much easier to declare great power competition than it is to implement it.
Very, very good, and thank you. Our next question from Commander Charles Sharkey. Why do you think the Obama-Iran deal was a failure? Wasn't the Iran nuclear weapons deal relatively good and better than any other deal we have with any other newly nuclear armed countries, North Korea, Pakistan, Iran, etc.?
Yeah, and again, this is a personal opinion, but I think that the Iran deal nominally was a success if it was narrowly construed. That is, what it bought was a finite period of time in which the Iranians, at least on paper, agreed not to pursue weaponization. The weaknesses of the deal were multiple, and I have a theory as to why they ended up there. But one is, any serious student of nuclear proliferation knows that the long pole in the tent is fissile material. It is not a mystery how to design a nuclear weapon in this day and age, particularly a fission weapon. We've known about the technology basically since the late 40s. And so it's all about fissile material. And there were very loose controls over Iranian generation of fissile material and lots of loopholes to be exploited. The second piece of it was that there was a time limit beyond which Iran would be free of such constraints that it had agreed to. So it was at best a Band-Aid in time terms. I think most importantly is that inside the Obama administration, there was a larger rationale to this. The notion was striking a deal on nuclear weapons would lead Iran to become more moderate in its behavior, that lifting sanctions would make them a better neighbor in the Middle East, less aggressive, less revisionist. And I think almost overnight, it was clear that that second ambition was a false hope. What we see is Soleimani flying to Moscow within weeks of the signature of the accord. What we see is continued intense competition and Iranian sponsorship of the civil war in Syria, dabbling in places like Afghanistan as well, and threatening US interests elsewhere. So I think if the goal unstated of the Obama deal was to moderate Iranian behavior, that did not go well. It's a much more complicated argument to make. Was the Trump administration right to tear the thing up? That's a separate topic. But I think as a liberal answer of a cooperative answer to the relationship with Iran, I think it was pretty unsatisfying. And this is not a partisan comment on my part. I can't identify a single US administration that has succeeded in its outreach to the Iranian regime. We may be onto something if we start paying attention to that.
Clearly, this is certainly a topics of interest because there's no shortage of questions coming in from our guests. So and good questions. So I'm glad you're the one that has to answer these things. So from a good friend of mine, Candace Eckert, competition suggests winners and losers. Why does winning and losing why does winning and losing look like in this context? And what are the risks to international order if a great power becomes a loser?
So again, I think the question hits on this fundamental philosophical distinction between a liberal and a realist framing. For a true liberal framing, you would say there are, I'm not as worried about what the other guy gets. I'm just worried if X action, X agreement, X transaction leads to me becoming more secure or wealthier. And a realist version is a purely zero-sum game, that there are only winners and losers, that any Chinese advance is an American defeat. And, part of this is philosophical. Which model do you think best fits this? But the meaning of winning and losing in this competition is certainly most acute for the people in the regions where the conflict is occurring, where the sort of geological plates are coming into friction here. I think certainly for Taiwan, the stakes could not be higher. For the Taiwanese, it's the tension between a democratic and vibrant Taiwanese democracy on the one hand, and an increasingly authoritarian and repressive regime in the People's Republic of China. We've already seen this play out essentially in Hong Kong. Now, you could say, okay, that's a problem for Taiwanese or for residents of Hong Kong. Why is it a problem for the United States? Fair question. But I think the sense is increasingly that if the United States does not draw some line or series of lines with the Chinese and essentially continues to retreat from its position in Asia, this will be a significant diminution of American status. We will go from superpower to one of many powers, and our ability to influence the terms of the international order, whether they're commercial or political or in human rights terms, will diminish dramatically with that. Losing in this competition is allowing others, in many cases less savory, to dictate the terms of international interaction.
Thank you. Obviously, Taiwan is a key component here, and I think collectively you're addressing this. But from our Chairman Emeritus, Bill Obenchain, how do you assess the risk of Taiwan becoming a serious flashpoint?
I think the risk has been rising. I think the expansion of Chinese military power in particular, and their focus on Taiwan as the central first largest problem for them operationally, has set up a very tense situation, one in which political rapprochement between Taiwan and the PRC looks less likely than ever. The Taiwanese look at Hong Kong and they say, one country, two systems doesn't work. The Chinese will violate that and essentially absorb us. So the political solution to Taiwan appears to be rapidly vanishing. As a result, this makes the Chinese regime, the PRC, much more likely to consider the use of military force. I think while it seems perhaps from an American point of view, minor stakes to talk about Taiwan, as soon as one would be involved in a shooting war with the People's Republic of China, regardless of the local stakes, the war would rapidly become a war for predominance in the international system. The consequences of the United States losing a war over Taiwan would be dramatic. I think it would lead to a fundamental realignment of alliances in Asia, and also sort of a replacement in some sense of the United States by China in a series of forums well outside the security space. So I think the danger is that any one of these local engagements, once you're into them, it's a bit like the First World War. It doesn't matter that it was about an assassination in Sarajevo. All that matters at this point is who wins, who loses, and who dictates the terms of the peace. And so I think the likelihood of a flashpoint in Taiwan is going up. I think the risks are enormous if it occurs, and the consequences of losing it from the American point of view are tremendous. And we could lose it two ways. We could fight and lose it, or we could essentially wash our hands of it and lose it in a different way.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. From Victor Sussman. Unlike the Cold War, the West is far more economically connected with China than the former Soviet Union. Restoration of a Western industrial base seems critical to mounting a credible challenge to an ascendant China militarily or otherwise. How can leadership persuade a shift in short-term focus by business to attenuate the risks of economic entanglement with China in service to broader national or international policy goals?
So it's a great question. And it's one reason why, as people look at this, sometimes the early Cold War analogy is not the only possible analogy. One way of looking at the current situation is it may be more similar to the relationship in 1914 commercially between the UK, Great Britain, and Germany. High levels of economic interpenetration, creating this coupling and mutual vulnerability in some sense to disruption. But the point is, what could we do about it? I think on the one hand, businesses for their own reasons are starting to reassess fundamentally two things. One is their approach to intellectual property, and the second is their approach to supply chain integrity and risk. As the likelihood of conflict with China over something increases, I think it's in the self-interest of American corporations to think about other places relatively speaking, cheaper than manufacturing in the United States, they might want to shift parts of their supply chain. And we're already seeing some of this decoupling. I think the intellectual property front, personally, I would like to have seen as really the centerpiece of this administration's pushback on China. It's hard to look at US foreign direct investment in China and not be appalled by the serial theft of intellectual property facilitated by the state, but executed by corporations, and its devastating impact on our long-term power and prosperity. I think this is one of these cases where we hold the moral high ground, and we ought to have been more focused and aggressive on that in some ways than some of the raw material disputes we got into about agriculture and the like. So I think the key is trying to crack down on theft of intellectual property, try to make common cause with the Europeans on this, try to encourage businesses either to onshore or to move offshore production outside of the area of possible conflict. And this may be a way to sweeten the deal with other prospective allies, whether they're in the Western Hemisphere or in parts of Southeast Asia. So I think there's no silver bullet here, but it's something that is both already underway by independent actors and is going to have to accelerate if we're going to be serious.
Thank you, sir. And just we got just about 3 minutes. What are the largest missing pieces in great power competition strategy? Where would the U.S. get the highest marginal rate of return in future defense investments? Yeah, so this this is closer to the sort of bread and butter work that we do at the War College. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to solve operational and strategic problems, or the seam between the two. My sense is that the last 20 years have certainly been absorbed in investments focused on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. You're in the middle of a huge shift towards investing in high-end warfighting, and you're seeing it across the services. In the Navy, we've been helping out at the War College recently with the Navy's look out as far as 2030 and 2045, what kind of fleet would be appropriate. I think that the highest marginal return probably comes in many of the capabilities that our enemies have invested in for the last 10 to 20 years, and we have not. An example would be conventional ballistic missile technology. Under the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement that we signed at the tail end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, we essentially got out of the business that created things like the nuclear versions of Pershing missile in Europe and ground launch cruise missile in Europe. So by treaty obligation, we got out of that business. The Chinese were never signatories to this. They built an enormous array of conventional ballistic missiles that are highly accurate that can now threaten US bases and US vessels afloat. For a bunch of technical reasons, engineering reasons, it's a heck of a lot easier to build a ballistic missile than it is to build a system to knock one down. And so I think the emerging consensus in the defense community is the United States has to get back into some of these areas, start thinking about building long-range precision capabilities, the kind of command and control architectures, communications architectures necessary to control them, big investments in space, in surveillance and redundant communications. Those, I think, are the growing tips of the American defense investments. But this will not come cheap. And if I were to say, what's the thing that worries me most post-November, foreign policy elites may agree on China being a big problem, but if we're not willing to spend what's necessary to match this threat or to deter violence in Asia, we're going to regret that. And the real tension may be a domestic political one between demands for resources for things like environmental investments or social investments on the one hand, and the kind of military investments that would be necessary to get back on our feet. Dr. Jackson, thank you. Thank you very much for, again, taking the time out of your busy schedule to spend it with us this morning. You are a true friend of the foundation, and we are grateful for your continued leadership and support, and hope that you will join us again soon. Ladies and gentlemen, mindful of the time, it's just about 12 o'clock. It is time for our 10-minute break. We will commence the second half of our presentation sharply at 12:10. During the break, The foundation will be showing a brief video that captures the true mission of the Naval War College, and then you'll hear a brief recorded remarks from the foundation's Vice Chairman and Treasurer, Dan Holland. Thank you, and we will now commence the break. See you in a little bit.
Good afternoon and welcome back. I hope that you enjoyed Dr. Jackson's comments as much as I did. Great power competition is the most significant strategic challenge we face today, and understanding the historical perspective is critical when formulating our national strategy. I'm Dan Holland, and I'm the Vice Chairman and Treasurer of the Naval War College Foundation. On behalf of all of us at the Foundation, I want to thank you for joining us for today's symposium. We wish that we could be gathered together with you in person in San Francisco, but are very glad that you have made time to join us virtually. We are proud to showcase some of the outstanding talent we have on the faculty of the Naval War College and the thought leadership they provide for our students and for the country. As treasurer, I oversee the finances for the foundation. This pandemic has presented many challenges to us, as it has for many nonprofit organizations. In our case, we've been unable to host events in person, which historically have been an important source of revenue for us. On behalf of the Naval War College Foundation, I want to thank all of our sponsors and all of you who have joined in support of the foundation and the college. We are very pleased with the level of participation in our virtual events this year, and we're happy to see many of our longtime supporters and are excited to welcome those of you who are joining us for the first time. Your support helps our foundation as we work with the college to educate and develop leaders by building strategic and cultural perspectives and enhancing our students' capabilities to advise senior military leaders and national policymakers. We thank you for your belief in and support of the Naval War College and its mission, and for helping us educate today so that we may secure tomorrow. Strength through knowledge and peace through strength. Your support provides critical funds necessary to develop military and civilian leaders who are skilled in the strategic and operational challenges of today and tomorrow, dedicated to preserving our national security. The more adept we are at navigating the challenges of great power competition, the more likely we are to avoid armed conflict. We now look forward to hearing from Dr. Mary Thompson-Jones about the strategic issues in the Arctic. We really appreciate your continuing support. Please enjoy the rest of the symposium. Back to you, George.
I think I'm with you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. If not, I apologize. It is now my privilege to introduce to you our second guest speaker, Dr. Mary Thompson-Jones, a career diplomat, professor, and publisher author on U.S. foreign policy and the practice of diplomacy. A professor at the Naval War College and National Security Affairs Department, Dr. Thompson-Jones's diplomatic experience spans a 23-year career as a foreign service officer in leadership roles in the Czech Republic, Canada, Guatemala, Spain, and Washington, D.C. She retired with the rank of Minister Counselor and is the recipient of several superior and meritorious honor awards. Before joining the faculty of the Naval War College, she directed a master's program at Northeastern University. Dr. Thompson-Jones has a Bachelor of Science degree from California State University in Political Science and Journalism, a Master of Arts degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Law and Diplomacy, and a Doctorate of Education from the University of Pennsylvania in Higher Education Management. She is considered an expert in many areas, including the Arctic, diplomacy, Europe, foreign policy, national security, and NATO, just to mention a few. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Mary Thompson-Jones.
Thank you very much, George, for the kind introduction. And may I also thank the Naval War College Foundation. You do so much for those of us on the faculty, and it's such a nice relationship. I've benefited, I know many of my colleagues have benefited, so thank you for your support to us. And also a shout out to some of my former students who are the inspiration, I think, for most of us on the faculty to continue to do the research and writing that we do. So I'd like to invite you to join me in imagining the Arctic, and in particular, imagining America's Arctic. I can't think of a better shot than this one of the Northern Lights in Fairbanks, Alaska. And the American Arctic, as seen from Alaska, is indeed a maritime domain. But as this photo illustrates, it's also useful to consider our Arctic from the air, the land, and all that lies underneath the land. So I hope in the course of this short presentation and in our questions and answers to be able to convince you that the Arctic is important and to give you some new reasons why you should care about it. So of course, we're going to start with Alaska. And it's nice that the overarching theme today is great power competition, because Alaska was, of course, born out of great power competition when Secretary of State Seward bought it from a cash-strapped Russia back in 1867. I like this map because it illustrates a lot of the dimensions to Alaska. It is indeed a maritime domain, as you see, surrounded by the Arctic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. It also touches upon the Beaufort, the Chukchi, and the Bering Seas. And it has 1,100 miles of Arctic coastline, which is a small portion of the 34,000 miles of coastline Alaska has, which is more than the entire continental United States. It has a population of only 735,000, which means that it has more senators than it has representatives in the House. Also of interest and relevance is that only about 1,700 inhabitants live north of the Arctic Circle. And you see the Arctic Circle along here, which essentially is the northern third of the state. It's also the only US territory that was ever invaded, and that's thanks to the Aleutian Islands, which at 1,200 miles is the world's largest or longest archipelago of small islands. The islands of Kitku and Attu were invaded by the Japanese during World War II. And as you can see from the geography, it has few roads and few highways. It has a culture of aviation. And the last point that's important to mention is that the native corporations are a huge economic and demographic factor in the state. They comprise about 15% of the population. And because of an enlightened decision made by Interior Secretary Stuart Udall, who served in the Reagan administration, instead of the usual pattern of giving natives reservations upon which to live, Alaska has native corporations in which natives wield economic power and make economic decisions about their lands. And as a result, they contribute about $10.5 billion in revenue to the state's budget of about $50 billion. Many of the 12 native corporations are part of the Fortune 500, so they've done exceedingly well. So while by many standards, Alaska is a superlative state, when we look at Alaska in the context of the Arctic, it becomes somewhat smaller. As you can see, Russia and the littoral coastline comprises about 53% of the Arctic. Canada, with its archipelago, comprises about another 45%. And Alaska is only a small portion of the Arctic. If we define the Arctic as beginning at 66.3 degrees north latitude, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not that makes sense anymore. You can see the little red line here, which is the isotherm line, at which point temperatures that fall below 10 degrees Celsius are the dividing line of the Arctic and non-Arctic states. Other proposals have considered the tree line, have considered moving the line south because, of course, global warming has changed the geographic and climatic aspects of this region. So what we're seeing right now, and the reason why I'm inviting you to care about the Arctic, is we have an unusual confluence of things happening all at the same time. Everyone has heard about the fact that ice is melting. A shorthand way of thinking about it is that the Arctic has lost about 40% of its ice in the last 40 years. We've seen an increase in ships going through the Arctic. We've seen an increase in tourism, and we've also seen an increase in coastal flooding. It's affected communities, both indigenous and Russian communities on the Russian coastline as well. We've seen the entry of other nations not usually seen in the Arctic, most particularly China, picking up on Professor Jackson's presentation a while ago. This is another area of intense activity for China. And in short, the Arctic has become part of great power competition. Well, I propose that all this rapid change has led to a great deal of unpredictability, and unpredictability has led to a fraught security environment. Developments have been unexpected. The ice has melted faster than even scientists and climatologists had imagined. The unshared interest has been a surprise. The fact that not everyone regards the Arctic in the same way is an important factor. The way in which the United States has responded has been uneven at best, conflicted at worst. Unfamiliar actors, not least of which China has come to the forefront. Many others have also asserted their rights and their assertion that the Arctic could be part of the global commons. And as a result, we see increasing unease in the Arctic. So, nowhere is this more apparent than in Russia. And it's no secret that Russia has made the Arctic the focal point of its resurgence on the global stage. This map from the Council on Foreign Relations gives a sense of the kind of buildup that we've seen. We have not in any way countered or matched this buildup, and that's a factor that's worrying for a lot of reasons. Our allies, Russia's neighbors, particularly Norway, Finland, Sweden, have seen the results of this buildup. The Baltic states have felt more threatened. The gap that occurs between Greenland, Iceland, which is off the map here, and the UK has been filled with Russian submarines, and there's been a fair level of harassment. So certainly the militarization of Russia has been worrying. But more so, I contend, than the military aspect is the economic aspect. I made reference earlier to Russia's North Sea route. The North Sea route is in the Aqua, and under Vladimir Putin, Russia rediscovered this. The route, of course, has existed since time immemorial, but it's mostly been icebound. As global melting has occurred, as luck would have it, the melting has been more rapid on the Russian side, and as a result, it's possible to sail through ice-free waters or waters that have very little ice for many months of the year. Russia has developed that route and asserted its rights over that route and has tried to economically develop the route. One aspect that goes hand in hand with the North Sea route is the Yamal Peninsula. The Yamal Peninsula has been an area of great exploitation of natural gas and now liquefied natural gas. And Russia's been able to build, to exploit this, and to grow economically thanks to this natural resource. The other routes, before I change the slide, are also worth thinking about. The green one is hypothetical. This is called the transpolar route. And someday, if the ice continues to melt with great rapidity, as it is now doing, it will be possible to cross through the center of the Arctic, which obviously in terms of length of sail would be the shortest route. The other route, which concerns us more directly, is the Northwest Passage. This sails through waters that start in Alaska and go through Canada. And you may notice that I'm avoiding calling them Canadian waters because it's one of the areas that the United States and Canada dispute, whether or not Canada has the right to consider these part of its territorial waters, its extended territorial waters, its exclusive economic zone, and all of that make a big difference. At the moment, it's a moot point because it's still largely frozen for so much of the year that economically very few ships have used this route. In future, that could change. And if Canada and the United States could come to an agreement about sailing through the Northwest Passage, it could become an attractive alternative to the Russian route, which is difficult for a number of reasons. Russia asserts sovereignty over it. It requires substantial fees. It insists on pilotage, and it makes it less attractive economically than it might otherwise be. So in some ways, it's harmed its own economic interest, at least in the early stages of developing this particular route. The other new threat is China. And back in 2018, China issued a white paper that really astounded Arctic scholars. They declared themselves to be a near Arctic nation. They also talked about building a polar silk route that has involved investment, largely in Russia, but also investment forays into Canada and especially into Greenland. The investment in Russia focused on the Yamal Peninsula and the liquid natural gas port because China needed it and Russia needed cash. Why did Russia need cash? Because in 2014, it had invaded Crimea, and as a result of sanctions, it was not able to fulfill a lot of its ambitions in the Arctic or elsewhere because it could not find international partners and international investment. China was willing to be that partner, and the resulting partnership that the two nations have brokered since that time has become stronger every year, and for many of us become quite worrying. Whether or not China is serious about the Arctic, is going to see it as part of its global plan, or if it's merely a sidebar or a margin to what's really happening elsewhere, as Professor Jackson talked about in the South China Sea, remains to be seen. But at the moment, Russia needs China. China is willing to be the partner for Russia. And as a result, both militarily and economically, we're seeing heightened activity in China. I mentioned earlier that the United States has been uneven in its response. You see the quote below from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo at the Arctic Council, which was one of the more memorable quotes from that biennial meeting. And there are a lot of states that would agree, particularly other Arctic states, which are very jealous about maintaining their status as Arctic states and are not interested in expanding the club. Since we're talking about Pompeo, there's another example here where he lumps Russia and China together as part of a new security vacuum and warns the United States that we risk allowing domination and control if we do not step up our own activities in the region. And we have taken that warning seriously. NATO, which has many Arctic members, the United States, Canada, Norway, Iceland, Denmark, thanks to Greenland. And then we have offered enhanced opportunity partnerships to Sweden and Finland to join us in exercises. And NATO has been criticized for not stepping up soon enough into the Arctic, which is clearly part of NATO's territory. But we've seen of late more interest from NATO. The biggest NATO exercise since 1989 was hosted by our good allies, Norway. It was called Trident Juncture. And we even brought a US aircraft carrier into that exercise. That exercise has been countered in turn by Russia hosting the largest ever exercises that is held in the Arctic, celebrating its renewed presence in the Arctic. So we can now point to a pattern of escalated military activity, escalated presence, and escalated activity, which without a underpinning security policy of what it is we want to achieve in the Arctic will risk becoming nothing more than a series of exercises, counter exercises, and more exercises. So let me change the dialogue, if I may, and offer a different idea and another way of seeing the Arctic. And I've turned this map on its side because I want to invite you to remember that the United States is a continental power. And one of the problems with looking at Alaska, mighty and superlative as it is that it is something of a dead end for the United States. If we think about the Arctic only in terms of Alaska, we quickly run up against the Bering Strait, 50 miles across before we reach Russian territory. We deal with sparse populations. We deal with not a lot of economic activity or other reasons for us to be interested in it. But if we think of ourselves as a continental power, and if we look at Alaska as merely one bookend of the Arctic, and we link it up with our northernmost state on the East Coast, which is Maine, we start to see a different perspective, and we start to see ourselves as continental Arctic powers rather than just accidental Arctic powers, thanks to a single state. So luckily, this idea has achieved some resonance in Congress, and we actually have congressional groups that deal with this. The Senate Arctic Caucus, led by the two Alaskan senators, both of whom are extremely active on Arctic issues, have been joined by Senator Angus King, former governor, now senator from the state of Maine. There's also a House Arctic Working Group in which we see Representative Don Young from Alaska partnering with Representative Rick Larsen of Washington State Also, an important point on the access and the idea of looking at the Arctic as a continental American domain. So what have they been up to? Well, last month, Senator Dan Sullivan brought the Navy Secretary up to Alaska in order to make a pitch for a naval base. One of the things that we know about Alaska is that its history, it was built as part of a military effort dating back to World War II to retake the islands that had been occupied by the Japanese. And it has a terrific military presence. In fact, the Department of Defense spends about $4,000 per head on every Alaskan man, woman, and child. And Alaska has done well playing its military card. The Air Force is up there. The Army has been there from day one. The Navy, for a number of reasons, has been less eager to take on the pressure coming from Alaskan senators and others to make a permanent presence for itself. The NDAA for the past year directed the Army Corps of Engineers to make a study of potential deep water ports. The city of Nome, or maybe I should say the town of Nome, is often seen as a future potential deep water port. Unfortunately, much of the waters around Alaska are shallow. This includes Nome, and whether or not Nome has a future with the Navy or not remains to be seen. But this has been a huge push from Senator Sullivan, supported by his colleague, Senator Murkowski. The Air Force has done a lot better, and it's a great example of the power of strong congressional pressure. One of the air bases not far outside of Fairbanks was due for closure, Eielson Air Force Base, and thanks to a full court press from the Alaskan delegation, it was able to overturn that to such an extent that it is now the home of the F-35As. They are in the process of transferring some 54 fighter jets. And once they do, Eielson will be the location with the most advanced fighter jets of any place in the world. So, fulfilling Billy Mitchell's prophecy, which is quoted in congressional testimony more times than anyone can count, this proves the point. But I've got Senator Murkowski's quote up here because she is trying to do something which I think Alaska is late to discover, which is to move from the military and wean itself of the military habit and become more of a holistic state and develop commerce and trade. So enter Maine, state of Maine, Alaska's new partner that no one had thought of. This is the port of Portland, and it's filled with container ships from an Iceland company called Eimskip. Eimskip used to be located in Virginia, and the state of Maine and the Port Authority went down and lured Eimskip up to Portland with a huge investment in revitalization, with rail links, with refrigeration facilities, and with geography on its side. It cuts the shipping length, it cuts shipping time. It also surpasses Canada because, of course, Maine is an entry point to the United States, which cannot be said of any of the Canadian ports, many of which might be equally, if not more attractive. As a result of Maine's coup, getting Eimskip and others to relocate, Maine has positioned itself to be a fulcrum in the American Arctic, looking at the North Atlantic and Scandinavia and the European Arctic. In normal years, there's a conference that takes place in Iceland called the Arctic Circle. It didn't happen this year because of COVID, But the last year in 2019, when it was held, the governor of the state of Maine brought a delegation of 60 people, more than any other state, and sat down, signed trade agreements with countries like Finland and Sweden and Iceland, and really exercised its economic power as a US entry point to the Arctic. So to me, that is an important aspect of the future. And here we have Senator King, the architect of this idea, talking about how Maine could work with Alaska, work with the lower 48, or the lower 47 in the case of Maine, to do a lot more on the commercial and economic front to cement the Arctic in American minds and in American pocketbooks as something that we need to take more control of and we need to approach more holistically. So I'll leave you here with this last thought, which is seeing this as a continental power offers more connections. If the Arctic continues to melt, all of this becomes easier. And as Alaska and Maine possibly join force, along with Canada, a friendly allied country, we could do a lot more than merely hold military exercises. We could begin to exploit the Arctic. We could develop it. We could work with Arctic people and make our interest defined as going far beyond the military. One of the better speeches from the Coast Guard talked about the fact that presence equals influence. And my concluding thought is that security cannot be an end in and of itself. And having military exercises simply to create a presence might serve to deflect Russian and Chinese ambitions in the Arctic. But security cannot exist in a vacuum. There has to be something to protect. There has to be something worthy of the presence and the sacrifice that the presence entails. So I would say that as we look to counter great power competition in the Arctic, we need to double down on building an economic viable presence that will give us that thing that will be worth protecting. So thanks, and I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Thompson-Jones, thank you so very much for a wonderful and informative presentation. The Arctic is an incredible region, and I always enjoy learning more about it, particularly the strategic aspects of it and potential national security concerns. We have about 15 minutes for questions from our guests, and there's no shortage to them. So getting in a couple, so we're trying to group them together a little bit. But the first one is from Tom Peterson. How many icebreakers do we have versus Russia and China?
What a great question. Thanks for giving me a chance to talk about that. The United States currently has 1.5 icebreakers. We have 2 poles, as you know, and we have a permanent presence in Antarctica. One of the icebreakers is dedicated to serving our scientific and research community in Antarctica. The other icebreaker is for the Northern Hemisphere. Unfortunately, both icebreakers are well past their shelf dates, and every season we read about breakdowns, fires in the engine rooms, repairs, and essentially the Coast Guard has done a phenomenal job keeping this thing going with sealing wax and rubber bands and duct tape. Luckily, Congress has passed authorization for the building of 5 new icebreakers. I'm happy to say that the first one is actually under construction in shipyards in Mississippi, which pleases me for 2 reasons. One is that it's good that we're building one at long last. It's also good to see that other states are going to have a stake in the Arctic, and nothing could be farther from the minds of most people in Mississippi probably than that their work and labor would be going towards increasing and enhancing America's Arctic presence. But I'm glad that it is so. However, we have a lot of catching up to do. Russia has somewhere in the low 40s of icebreakers currently up and running. Largely, these are there to support the Northern Sea route, to help those ships carrying LNG and other supplies get in and out. Not all icebreakers are created equal, so you get into disputes about those that deal with heavy ice or medium ice. Nonetheless, they have maybe 41, 43. They also have 11 that they're building. So they are envisioning a future in which icebreakers will be a very definite part of their maneuverability and economic expansion in the Arctic. China has 3 icebreakers. It bought the first one from Ukraine, looked at how they were made, built the second one itself, and has a third one, which will be nuclear powered, which it hopes to launch very soon. So other countries, Canada has several more than we do, and Finland is a powerhouse in terms of icebreaker building. It has offered on numerous occasions that it would be willing to lease icebreakers to the United States. We've not picked up on that offer. Nonetheless, it's by any standard, Republican, Democrat, Independent, what have you, it is shameful how little icebreaker power we have to enhance our presence in the Arctic.
Yeah, particularly since it's been around. This topic has been around for several years now. It's a shame, as you say. From the second question now from and I hope I pronounced his last name correctly, Jeff Rakowski. Based upon current ice melt rates, how long will it be before Russia is projected to have ports on its northern coast that are ice-free year-round?
It's another great question, and it depends because we look at data from the National Snow and Ice Data Center. They've been taking satellite photos since 1981, the year that the first satellites were launched, and we can see trend lines over time. And what happens with sea ice melting is that it's not linear. Weather patterns change. There are times when there's actually more sea ice, less sea ice. What is indisputable is that we've lost about 40% in the Arctic. We've also seen the nature of the sea ice change. Much of it now is what is called 1 year ice. It means that it comes and goes in the course of a single year, whereas before we had ice that was many meters thick that was the result of centuries or millennia of accumulation. I didn't have time in this presentation to show you what's happening in Greenland, but we're seeing rapid ice melt on the island of Greenland, and at the rate it's going, there will not be much ice left in 20, 30 years. In terms of Russia, there are projections that they will have ice-free ports within 20 years. Some of their ports, particularly in Murmansk, right up here, are already virtually ice-free. The problem in Russia is that while it has a population advantage over the United States and Canada, its populations are dying off and moving. Many of the Russian cities along the port, starting from Murmansk, going to Vorkuta, Norilsk, Tiksi, Magadan, just south of the Arctic Circle, are the result of gulags. And the people were originally put there through the prison system, and the towns were built up as one commodity towns. So Norilsk produced nickel, others produced iron. As the Soviet Union fell and people were allowed to move within Russia, a lot of them voted with their feet and said, I don't want to live up here anymore, and decamped for other places. The ability of Russia to attract newcomers to the region has not been great, and the housing, the amenities, and other things that you would want in order to have a good life there have not really been forthcoming because Russia is fairly cash-strapped and it hasn't been a priority. So there's a lot of discontent, and where Russia has definitely been able to put military people up there who don't have a choice, the workers needed to continue to operate a highly industrialized Arctic, which is Russia's vision of its own Arctic, is really compromised. And the ice-free ports aren't going to matter nearly as much as a young labor force that will be there for 10 or 20 years. What we're seeing now is an aging labor force, people dying off, and no new people coming in to replace them.
Wow, thank you. From John Hanley, can you address fisheries in the Arctic? And if I could add on to that, any concerns?
Yes. Well, looking back at America's own Arctic, Alaska here, fisheries are one of the most important sustainable industries in Alaska, and they represent something like $5 billion to the state, particularly when you add the value on of wholesale fish. What we're seeing because of global warming and ice melting is migration of fish moving further and further north. This has happened in the state of Maine and the Grand Banks fishing areas as well. So fishing is imperiled. One of the good things about international organizations is that we have seen agreements about international agreements, including Russian and Chinese signatories, to save the North Pole region and keep that as a no fishing zone for the moment, as a means of protecting the fish that are there. But it's definitely a problem, and many species have died off. Alaska's had to have shorter seasons for some of the species that it fishes. Some of the fish have either migrated or they've canceled the fishing seasons for certain species altogether.
Amazing. Well, thank you for that response. From the next question is from Deborah Lyle. How could the U.S. integrate Space Force with our satellites with the Arctic to expand the U.S. control of sea lanes in the Arctic?
Oh, a nice imaginative question. Yes, and one that has some historical precedent as well. Some people remember something called the Dew Line, which started in Alaska and stretched across Canada all the way through Greenland. And the purpose of it was to serve as an early warning for launch of intercontinental ballistic missiles that would have been coming from, we imagined, the Soviet Union. The Dew Line and its more modern permutations still exist. And Alaska, particularly the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, has been super active in aviation and in space. It has a rocket launching facility, various other UAV testing sites. So the potential for Alaska to be a headquarters or an important branch of our space program is something that Alaska has not been shy about propounding. It also has geographic attractiveness in terms of proximity. Much as I am advocating that the lower 48 need to engage in the Arctic, there are some things that only geography can do, and Alaska has geography on its side, and it's definitely engaged in a serious way about how it can exploit its geographic assets to enhance what we're trying to do with space.
A lot of innovative options to address and make sure that we can consider as part of our grand strategy. From David Reynolds, ma'am, thank you for the excellent presentation on a subject not talked about enough. What are some of the specific strategies using diplomatic, economic, and informational instruments of power the U.S. could use to improve our Arctic security situation?
Well, thank you, Dave, as usual, for a great question. We have an organization called the Arctic Council, which comprises the 8 Arctic states. The United States is a member, and we maintain a diplomatic presence. We work with the Arctic Council. Unfortunately, the mandate for the Arctic Council is limited to environmental and sustainability issues. When Secretary Pompeo spoke at the last Arctic Council meeting, and you saw the little quote I had up, he startled many of the Arctic Council member states because he strode into the area of security and defense. And the Arctic Council is expressly prohibited from considering those two items. It's one reason the Arctic Council has been successful, because it takes the stickiest points and just pushes them off the table. Nonetheless, I think most people who are scholars of the Arctic would see the Arctic Council as the single most important multilateral diplomatic fora. It's also important because it includes 6 indigenous groups as permanent members. They aren't members in the sense of states, but they have a permanent presence on the council. And then there are scores and scores of observers of all kinds. China was able to achieve observer status. I mean, there are some people who say now we may as well just open it to everyone. Nonetheless, the 8 members have accomplished a lot in terms of environment and shipping and other agreements that don't tread too much on the defense and security issues. There are proposals, among them one here at the Naval War College with our Arctic Scholars Working Group, looking at finding another venue in which we could discuss security and defense measures, and importantly, one in which we could include Russia. Because of the sanctions, we haven't had a lot of fora in which we could sit down with our Russian colleagues and meet. And there is a sense that events are transpiring so quickly in the Arctic and the ice is melting so rapidly that whether or not we approve or agree of everything Russia has done, we do need some venues in which we could sit down and hold a dialogue with them. So we have, some of my colleagues are working on ideas that would go along with that. Economically, the European Union has also tried to assert its sense that the Arctic is part of its region, but somewhat like NATO, it came to the game rather late in the day. It's not of one mind. And because several key Arctic states are not European Union members, such as Norway and Iceland, or Canada or the US, of course, it hasn't really caught a lot of traction. It certainly asserted itself in a supporting realm in terms of education, opportunity, environmental, climate issues, but I don't think it's made a real impact. Military, we've discussed, and intel, I think it will continue to be a point of increasing intelligence focus as we move forward.
Thank you, ma'am. We have about 2 minutes left. I'm not sure if you could answer this question. It's one from Ralph Ortolano. What will be the status of Iceland with respect to the Arctic Council when it is no longer an Arctic state? Does it have a mere 20 years left as an Arctic state?
Yes, Iceland is an Arctic state by virtue of Grimsey Island, which is on the north coast. It's an offshore island of Iceland, and it's inhabited only by about 60 or 80 people who are put there in order to make sure that Iceland still has a presence. I don't know. Iceland works hard to assert its influence, and it has lost. For example, there was a meeting in Ilulissat, Greenland, that was brokered by Denmark and only 5 Arctic nations were invited. It did not invite Finland or Sweden on the premise that these nations have no coast on the Arctic. It also did not invite Iceland. Iceland démarched, made diplomatic protests over this, was really quite incensed, but Denmark stuck to its guns and said, no, this particular meeting only concerns coastal Arctic states, and there are only 5 coastal Arctic states. So in some ways, Iceland is already seeing the results of having such a minimal piece of real estate.
Dr. Thompson-Jones, thank you so very much for spending time with us this afternoon. It was indeed an honor to have you as part of our program. And like Colin, we hope to get you back with us again soon for another event in the near future. But thank you. And again, Saturday, lots of things going on, and I appreciate you making time for us.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes this year's annual San Francisco Symposium. Thank you again for joining us and for your continued support and advocacy, particularly this year with many fiscal challenges that are imposed by the coronavirus. Your financial support in the form of gifts and donations and sponsorship assist us greatly in supporting the mission of the Naval War College, and particularly this year in closing out the year very strong. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and don't forget to get your bid or bids in for the Foundation's Patriot Auction, which will close, as I said, Monday afternoon at 3 p.m. If you want to learn more about the Naval War College Foundation or become a member or offer support to the Naval War College, or even begin your holiday shopping early at the Naval War College Foundation Museum store online, it remains closed physically, but it is available online. Please visit us at our webpage, nwcfoundation.org, and keep your eyes open for an announcement also regarding our planned holiday auction. And finally, a very special shout out to a very dear friend of the foundation, Mr. Dick Rosenberg, for his longtime support for this symposium. We look forward to a time when we can get together again, Dick, to host this event once again out on the left coast or in San Francisco, surrounded by many of your friends and colleagues that'll make this event even more special. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today. Thank you again for joining us on a Saturday. Stay safe and farewell for now.